I'll never forget the first time I was exposed to Minecraft. It was 2011 or 2012, and I was hanging out with some friends in their basement. They started raving about a new game they'd been playing recently, talking about structures they hoped to create and the resources they would need to obtain to make these creations a reality. As a child, I had a deep love for Legos, particularly due to the fact that they allowed you to build anything: a town, a space station, a castle, or anything else your mind could conceive. Naturally, I was intrigued when my friends mentioned a massive castle they were working on in their shared Minecraft world. At this time, Minecraft was not nearly as ubiquitous as it is today, so I had no frame of reference as to how the game would look or feel. When my friend pulled up the game on his laptop, I was a bit taken aback. At this point in time, every new game seemed to place a big emphasis on making graphical improvements over its predecessors, so the blocky appearance of Minecraft, an entire world constructed with 16 by 16 textured cubes, was far from the norm. My initial reaction was stifled laughter combined with disbelief. This was the game that had been absorbing so much of my friend's time? Admittedly, I was quick to write the game off, primarily due to its appearance. After a quick tour of my friend's world where they showed me their castle and some mining operations, I had seen enough, or so I thought. I went home an hour later, and for some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about that blocky game I had just seen. My immediate negative reaction was replaced rather quickly by curiosity. Within 15 minutes of getting home, I had downloaded Minecraft Pocket Edition Lite, the free version of the app, on my parents' iPad. This was an alpha version of Pocket Edition, which only included creative mode and a palette of 40 or so blocks and no mobs. It didn't matter. I spent the next few days building bases all over the terrain of the small world, begging my parents to let me upgrade to the paid version of the app. Each day, my interest in the game grew as I discovered new ways to organize my limited blocks and dreamt of new buildings and designs I could create. After 2 weeks, I finally wore my parents down and was able to buy the full version of the app, which was running a very early version of the game, seemingly alpha with a few tweaks for mobile gaming experience. While the PC version of the game was on full release version 1.0 or 1.2.5 at the time, my first few months with the game all took place on this early version of Pocket Edition. At the time, I didn't think much of my change of heart, but something about the game clearly spoke to my childhood self on a deeper level than other games of the era. Something had sparked my curiosity despite my initial, seemingly disinterested reaction. In the first video I ever posted on this channel, I talked a bit about why I feel older versions of the game capture the essence or soul of Minecraft better than modern renditions of the game. While I was making that video, I actually started a new beta world of my own, and in doing so, I rediscovered some of the joy and genuine curiosity that I found when I first picked up that free version of Minecraft Pocket Edition. In truth, returning to beta 1.7.3 gave me a feeling that I haven't felt playing Minecraft in years. I was fascinated. Was this just nostalgia, or is there something inherent to earlier versions of the game that elicits such a different feeling for players like myself? After much thought, I concluded that there had to be something else. I'm no stranger to nostalgia, and older games do hold a special place in my heart, but this feeling was different. It felt like I was starting something new, not returning to an old experience. In my first video, I made two statements that I believe drive to the heart of this phenomenon, which I'll use as the basis of this video today. At the time, I didn't think much of these remarks. They were my genuine feelings on the topic and nothing more. However, While doing research for this video, I realized that they hit on the exact facets of old Minecraft that inspire these feelings of whimsy and freshness in myself, and likely many other players who find themselves returning to these versions. The first statement I made, that Beta 1.7.3 encouraged and even exercised imagination, and the second statement, somehow it feels as we've gained more blocks and more building techniques, I've never felt more siloed into the structures that I create, as there seems to be a custom block for everything, serve as the basis for this video. In essence, newer versions of the game scientifically command less use of imagination for the average player. To illustrate this in action, I have two examples to share. First, let's take a look at a night clip from a beta world. So, with this clip, we have a pretty normal scene. You probably noticed a gravel path leading up to a house with two lampposts, one on each side. However, is that what you really saw? Well, not really. The lampposts are comprised of two fence posts with a glowstone block on top, with the old, less polished glowstone texture. The path itself, is it really gravel? Because the old gravel texture is simply a bunch of different shades of gray and sand red mixed in a 16 by 16 square. But I assume most of us perceive the first thing we discussed, a path with lampposts, rather than a path of gray pixels with two fence posts and a weird yellow block on top. What happened here? What you saw and what you perceived are rather different. This is the crux of this video. This is where your imagination was subconsciously exercised. For our analysis, let's call the subconscious process that took place here the translation layer. The translation layer, as we've coined it, is responsible for much more than just a verbal translation. It's really a key component of imagination. Subconsciously, your mind also likely thought of what these lampposts might look like in a real world. Since the representation we have in the scene is so generic, a light source on top of two fence posts, there's a lot of room for your mind to create its own interpretation of the scene. What type of light source are you thinking of? You may have imagined a wooden lamppost, or perhaps you pictured a more common black metal lamppost with a glass bulb on top. Or maybe if you're more into fantasy, you imagined that the glowstone was a floating orb atop an enchanted slab of wood. Essentially, no person will have imagined the exact same light source when translating the scene from Minecraft into its analogous real-life visual. We'll dive further into this in a bit, but for now, let's take a look at how the same scene might be reconstructed in a modern world. A pretty big difference visually, but the same outcome. Again, you likely perceived the gravel path flanked by two lampposts. However, this time it was much clearer in Minecraft what you were looking at. The rough glowstone blocks have been replaced by a custom block that is actually meant to represent a specific type of metal lantern. Similarly, the gravel, previously just a block of colored pixels, is now clearly a path of gravel mixed with small gray stones. Now I'd ask, what type of light source are you picturing for this scene? Many of us will now be picturing a much more similar real-world example of a light. Since this scene made use of the custom lantern object, our minds are not going to translate it as broadly. So the possibility of the light being imagined being held by a brass holder or being a magic orb are essentially gone. Now, why am I highlighting this? Well, essentially, for the second scene, our brain has to do much less work on the translation, and the outcomes are much less variable. The important thing to consider here is that this translation is not just busy work for our minds, it's our imagination at work. Fundamentally, for the second scene, most of us likely used a significantly smaller amount of imagination to understand what we were seeing. As I stated in my first video, imagination is something we, especially adults, use less and less over time, and is a muscle that atrophies with each year we age. We can see a similar phenomenon with the gravel, too. The original gravel texture leaves a lot to your imagination. With the varied colors and rough texture, one player might translate the texture into a muddy path with a few stones, while another might see a wet path of gray stones, and yet another might perceive a bunch of small, dry pebbles. In contrast, the smoother, more easily interpreted texture of modern gravel lends itself to a smaller array of interpretations. It's definitely not muddy or wet, and we know for certain that the gravel contains some medium-sized gray stones, so it cannot be all small pebbles. Again, we see that the modern visual just isn't stretching our imaginations nearly as far. Before we dive into why this is so detrimental to some gamers' enjoyment, let's take a look at one more example. We'll start with another scene from a beta world. Again, a pretty simple scene, but one which requires a lot of subconscious processing. What did you see in this scene? I'll bet most of us perceived some sort of potted plant, but the similarities probably end there. Some of us may have viewed this fence post with a bush on top of it as a shrub, others as a small bonsai tree, and others still as an oak sapling waiting to be transplanted once it grows bigger. Our minds had to do some heavy lifting here to translate a dirt block surrounded by trapdoors with a fence post and a leaf block on top of it into some sort of plant life. Now let's check out a possible modern version of this scene for comparison. Another similar outcome. We see a potted plant outside the house. However, there's much less room for our minds to interpret what we're seeing. What you see is much closer to the finished product. This is essentially either a potted oak sapling, or maybe you could interpret it as a small bonsai tree. We no longer have to determine whether or not the plant is potted, what kind of sapling it might be. Here it's clearly a small dark red clay pot, and we can't imagine it as some sort of shrub or growing tree. Essentially, there was much less work for us to do in the translation layer, and therefore much less room to exercise our imaginations. Again, this was made possible by a custom object in the flower pot. Now that we've examined the difference in translation or imagination required for these scenes, we can take a look at why this might make the modern game less enjoyable for some. Part of the inspiration for this video came from an entry I came across in a medical journal, a study testing if there's a correlation between imagination or creativity and happiness. And it turns out that such a correlation does exist. In fact, two 2021 studies, one on 256 undergrad students and one on 291 adults, both demonstrated a statistically significant correlation between participants' self-assessed creativeness and their happiness. To quote the post-study discussion section of the journal, overall, the two studies consistently showed that self-rated creativity has a positive relationship with subjective well-being, even after statistically controlling the impact of self-perceived stress. In an unrelated article, a Berkeley-educated psychology PhD stated that when we imagine positive things, our brains produce similar signals as if we were experiencing those things in real life. That's why positive imagination can be such a powerful tool for well-being. Essentially, using our imagination in positive ways is shown to make us happier. And based on what we saw earlier, I believe it's reasonable to conclude that the less polished textures and limited block palette of earlier Minecraft versions generally resulted in players using their imagination much more than they will in the average world in modern Minecraft. After much time, I firmly believe I understand one of the biggest reasons so many people find earlier Minecraft so charming and fun. It's literally chemical. It's not nostalgia alone that makes old textures or less refined builds so charming and enjoyable. It's the fact that they exercise vital parts of our brain that we rarely put to use today. I'll be the first to admit that there are some breathtakingly detailed builds and creations that can be pulled off in modern Minecraft that simply could not be created with a much more limited block palette. And if I were a master builder, I'd certainly prefer the modern versions for that reason. In general, it's understandable that those who prefer a more polished aesthetic might also lean more this way. However, for those of us that crave the simplicity, the calm, and the indescribable peace of those alpha and beta worlds, the next time you wonder if it's just nostalgia driving your enjoyment, remember, it's probably science too. Thanks for watching.